Welcome to the Museum Roadshow, everybody. I'm Amy Degerstrom, the director here at the Becker County Museum. Today we're going to talk about one of those things that you don't talk about in polite society very often, and that is women's undergarments. Now, of course, everybody recognizes the shape of this lady here. She's got that nice hourglass figure. This was a very common silhouette that was wanted in the Victorian era, so the 1800s. But how do you get that shape? How do you get that shape to fit into a dress like this? Well, in order to do that, you really have to wear all of these things underneath to make you fit, right? And in order to really achieve that shape, you actually had to start wearing those things at a very young age. So let's kind of move over to our kind of wall of shapewear here. You'll look at this tiny, tiny little bone corset up here at the top, and you can see a picture at the top of the grid as well. Girls actually started to wear corset-like garments. They were called stays when they were about 3 or 4 years old. And these garments were worn because literally you had to grow into that hourglass shape. The average person certainly doesn't look that way, right? And so in order to achieve that shape, you literally had to force your body to grow that way, very much like the binding of feet in Asia, for example. And so girls started wearing these corsets at the age of 3 or 4. This one here is for a girl who's probably was about 8 or 9. And those corsets got more and more restrictive the older that those girls got, until you got to a point where everybody thinks of Gone with the Wind and Mammy who's tying up, trussing up Scarlett, holding onto the bed, right? So you wanted that ideal waist size of 18 to 20 inches, which if you think about that is pretty tiny, right? Not really achievable for the average person, but that was the goal always, the things we do for fashion, right? Those corsets then also needed to have other garments to support the dress, so you had large petticoats, you had chemises, you had all kinds of other layers of clothing. The average Victorian woman wore about 20 pounds of clothing every day, so it was kind of an amazing weight to literally be carrying around. Also, couldn't eat very much because you're all sucked into that corset, and so that really tiny, petite shape that we often think about and associate with a Victorian upper-class woman particularly was really the result of those undergarments, because you couldn't eat much, couldn't drink much, couldn't move around much, right? And so you had literally a restrictive garment that would keep you in your place, literally, in a class system. Now, shapewear certainly didn't ever go away. We still wear it today. So you can see that kind of the progression of that shapewear from corset to, this was called a corset girdle. It was just the center of your body now. But you can see it has garters attached to it, or garter hooks attached to it for your stockings. Then you move to a full body kind of corset girdle here at the bottom. This is now the 1920s, 30s. Think about those flapper dresses. They're getting a little looser, right? But you still want a little bit of shape underneath. As you move into the 1940s and 50s, you get the kind of the top corset, or the girdle at the top of the body that was just to emphasize the waist and to kind of push up everything that should be pushed up and push down everything that should be pushed down. And then as you get into the 1950s and 60s, you kind of start to see things coming back into style. So you get these kind of zipper girdles. These are something that I think a lot of people remember wearing, or their grandmothers wearing these to keep that shape. A full body girdle. This now is synthetic material, so it's something that's made post 1940 or so. During the war, of course, there were rations on things like silk and nylon, so they had to start making their own kinds of synthetic materials in order to maintain these figures, I suppose. The benefit of that is that they really are stretchy, right? They start to move with your body a little bit more. So you can see that all the way up until today at the bottom here we have that shapewear that really gives us that figure that we're all looking for, I guess, as women, the things we do for fashion. So we're going to move on from corsetry and shapewear to talk a little bit about stockings next, if you want to come with me. Now, stockings are a whole other part of women's accessories, undergarments, and stockings had a big shift in the 1940s. I mentioned briefly before that during the war there was a lot of rationing because they needed to have silk and nylon for things like parachutes, uniforms, pieces of machinery and equipment. And so the silk stocking, which was really the peak, the pinnacle of what you wanted to wear, became something that you couldn't get anymore. And so your alternative was a kind of a cotton blend stocking, now not as shiny, not as pretty maybe as the silk, or a wool stocking, which of course was warm and probably practical in places like Minnesota, but again maybe not as fashionable. And so how did women change or kind of keep up the appearance of those silk stockings without having them? They actually painted their legs. They started using leg makeup. So think about today's self-tanner, very similar to that. You'd put it onto your legs, and the big thing of course in the 40s was that all the stockings had a visible seam up the back, and so literally you would have your sister or your friend or your mom draw the seam up the back with an eyeliner pencil so that you'd have a complete look. Now these stockings, these stocking paint or leg paint were commonplace in places like train stations, because of course who are you meeting at the train station? You're meeting your man, right, coming back from the front. And so you'd have a leg makeup counter in many of the train stations. They were here in Becker County. They were all over the country, so you could get them touched up so you'd look your best when you saw that person coming home. So lots of inventiveness when it came to undergarments as well, and to accessories. There was a movement by many folks to really change the way that those undergarments were looked at or talked about, and that's because of the health risks associated with them. So we'll move over to the parlor next door here, and we'll talk a little bit about Dr. Kellogg and his attempts to make us healthful and eat some good cereal as well. So we've talked a little bit about shapewear. We've talked about kind of the inventiveness of women in the 1940s during rationing. The one thing we need to talk about is how did we get from wearing something so restrictive as a boned corset to the things that we wear today? That really had to do with the dress reform movement. Now, if you look at some of the pictures that you see here, you can see that literally corsetry changed the shape of your body. It pushed organs where they shouldn't be. It never let your lungs develop fully. And so there were all kinds of medical concerns and problems. The corset that I'm holding here is a corset, again, for a young woman, probably 10 or 12 years old. That really caused shifts in your anatomy, I should say, that weren't necessarily healthful. And so as time moved by, we have folks like Dr. Kellogg. Now, Dr. Kellogg was a man who said all women and all people should really wear a union suit. Now, that's quite a shift, right, from a corset. The union suits were meant to be comfortable. They were meant to be supportive. They're kind of stretchy, very much like long underwear now. And these union suits, you can see a few examples over here in Dr. Kellogg's picture as well, were really meant to be the healthful variation of the undergarments that were so restrictive before. So you can see that there were attempts being made even in the 1880s, 1890s, but really they didn't take hold until probably the 1920s or so, when that kind of sexual revolution of the flappers really came into play. So there's many, many more stories we could talk about today for undergarments, but that's about all the time we have. So thanks for joining us on Museum Roadshow. We'll see you next time.